So in this video, we are going to look at the A and T organs. And then the next one, we'll look at the gonads. But so the following slides do explore all of the end organs of the HPATG axis and the hormones that they secrete in a bit more detail. So we've definitely already touched on um, the actions of the adrenal glands, the thyroid glands, and the gonads, but we'll just go into it in a bit more detail now. So we'll look at the adrenal glands first. So they are located on the top of each kidney. And the adrenal gland tissue can be seen as two distinct regions. You have the adrenal cortex and the medulla. So you'll see here, whether it's the kidneys or the adrenals, the cortex always refers to the outer part of the organ, and the medulla always refers to the inside part of the organ. So you have the cortex and the medulla. And you have two adrenal glands, and they sit right on top of your kidneys. You can see here. And so the cortex, the outside part, secretes glucocorticoids, the main one being cortisol. And then the medulla secretes the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline. And that's in response to sympathetic nerve stimulation. So the cortex is acted upon by ACTH, which is a hormone released from the pituitary gland, which has travelled through the blood, whereas the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline is triggered in response to sympathetic nerve stimulation. So, and also in addition to the glucocorticoids, the adrenal cortex also secretes mineralocorticoids. So these are hormones that affect electrolyte balance and blood volume, and one of the main ones is aldosterone. And they also secrete androgens as well. So androgens are include testosterone. Now the majority of androgen production is by the testes, but there is a little bit being produced by the adrenal cortex as well. So this is just a summary of the different hormones that are released from the adrenal cortex. So the corticoids. So we call them corticosteroids. So anything that's released from the cortex is called corticosteroids. So you have mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and then sex hormones or androgens. So we'll look at cortisol first. So cortisol, its regulation happens, or its production is stimulated by a number of different things. So the first one is ACTH, which is from the pituitary gland, low plasma glucose, stress, and circadian rhythm. So the following slide shows the regulation of cortisol secretion by ACTH. And remember, ACTH is usually secreted in response to CRH from the hypothalamus. CRH is in turn secreted in response to stress. And this pathway on the next slide, this shows you the HPA axis. So you have the hypothalamus here, the pituitary gland, and we have the adrenals. So CRH is released from the hypothalamus. It travels to the pituitary gland where it triggers the release of ACTH. ACTH then travels through the blood, binds to receptors in the adrenal cortex, and it stimulates the production of cortisol. And then an increase in cortisol levels inhibits the release of ACTH, and it also inhibits the release of CRH by the hypothalamus as well. And there are a number of different things that can trigger the production of CRH. So you have stress, circadian rhythm also affects it, we'll look at that. And stress can include low plasma glucose. It can also include sometimes physical stress and obviously emotional stress as well. So what are the effects of cortisol? So cortisol is classified as a glucocorticoid hormone. It has a wide range of effects. So the first one that it does is it increases lipolysis. So lipolysis is the breakdown of fat. So triglycerides, which are stored in your fat tissue, are broken down in response to the effects of cortisol. However, if the fat that is broken down isn't used, you end up kind of making more fat indirectly. It also stimulates the breakdown of protein, so it increases protein catabolism. Catabolism is the breaking down of things, anabolism is the building. It stimulates something called gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis is the production of glucose from other materials, so from proteins and from fatty acids. So it increases basically blood glucose by increasing gluconeogenesis in the liver. It also decreases the inflammatory response. It inhibits wound healing. It mobilizes calcium from the bone into the blood, and it also sensitizes the effects of the blood vessels to the effects of adrenaline. So these are all the different things that cortisol does. So it has a wide range effect, and one of the main ones is to increase blood glucose, and then also to inhibit the inflammatory response and wound healing, and also it mobilizes calcium from the bone. So we looked at cortisol's regulation, and the biggest thing is that it's ACTH triggers the production of cortisol, but it is, and that kind of also then affects the circadian rhythm, also affects ACTH secretion. So basically what happens is you have higher centers in the brain that are part of your master clock, and what they do is they tell if you're exposed to more light at certain times of the day, it will increase cortisol secretion. So cortisol levels tend to be higher in the morning, and then they tend to decline through the day. Now, some of the research is kind of conflicting on this, and this is not. The thing is, the research is conflicting. It's not conclusive in some areas, because some research has found that we don't have excessive amounts of cortisol secretion in response to really bright lights. It could be a combination of light and the time of the day specifically. So we definitely do know that, you can see here, that cortisol levels are at their highest at around 8 a.m. in the morning for most people. That's looking at a population. But so cortisol levels are high in the morning, and then they tend to drop down in the middle of the day. They tend to drop all through the day, and then they start to increase overnight, or late in the night time while you're sleeping, and that kind of even forces you to wake. So that's the cortisol. Now we will look at adrenaline and noradrenaline. So they are released from the medulla, and this is mediated via the sympathetic nerves of the autonomic nervous system. So the nerves of the autonomic nervous, the nerves of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system travel down from your brain, and they go all the way to your adrenal medulla. And what happens is you have adrenaline in the medulla, and it is released in response to sympathetic nerve stimulation. And there are a number of things that can trigger this. So it's stress, physical activity, and also low blood glucose levels, which is considered a stressor for the body. And so what happens then is, once adrenaline is released, it does a number of different things. So it increases the release of blood glucose from the liver into the blood. So again, it's increasing your blood sugar levels. It increases the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue into the blood. So that's a similar effect to cortisol. It increases your heart rate. It decreases blood flow through blood vessels of internal organs. So there's more blood being directed to your skeletal muscle and your heart. So it increases blood flow to the blood vessels of the skeletal muscle. So adrenaline constricts the blood vessels in your internal organs, but it dilates the blood vessels in your heart and your skeletal muscle. So you end up having an increase in blood flow to the skeletal muscle and a decrease into the internal organs. It also increases your blood pressure. It decreases function in the visceral organs, and it increases the metabolic rate in your skeletal muscles. So you want to have more energy in your muscles. So remember, the stress response is designed so that you have the energy to fight or flight. So in that moment, you want to be able to run, or you want enough energy to fight. So you have to have blood flow to the muscles to enable you to run or to fight, and then also to the heart to pump blood to these muscles. And at that moment in time, you don't need to be digesting your food. You don't need to be making or increasing urine production or different things. So here you have a decrease in the activity of these organs, but an increase in activity in your muscles, in the skeletal muscles. It also dilates your airways. So the reason it dilates your airways is because if you're going to make an increase in energy for the muscles, you need to have an increase in oxygen supply. Remember, oxygen is used to make ATP, energy. So by dilating the airways in your lungs, it increases air into your lungs, and so that oxygen can get to the tissues. It also dilates your pupils as well. So this is kind of a summary of the effects, and this response is basically to prepare the body to fight or flight. And the key thing is that stored fuel, so fat and glucose, are mobilized to produce energy. And what also happens is you have glycogenolysis. So glycogenolysis is basically the breakdown of glycogen. So glycogen is chains of glucose that are stored in your liver, and lipolysis is the breakdown of fat in your adipose tissue. And so by breaking down glycogen, you increase sugar production or increase sugar availability, glucose. And by breaking down fats, you can then use that energy for energy production as well. Or it can be converted into sugar as well. Blood pressure is increased, so you get an increase in blood flow around the body to the muscles. Blood's diverted to the large muscles and the heart, or the visceral organs. And the visceral organs are considered non-essential in the short term. And as a result, more energy is available to fight or to flee. So this is one of the key effects of adrenaline, is to enable you to fight or flee. So that is the adrenal glands. We'll now look at the thyroid. So the thyroid, it's a butterfly-shaped gland located just below your larynx, which is called your voice box. And it's made up of cells called follicular cells that produce thyroxine, T4, and iodothyronine, or T3. So collectively, they're both called the thyroid hormones. And so you have two types of cells in your thyroid. You have follicular cells, and you also have something called parafollicular cells. And the parafollicular cells produce calcitonin, and that hormone is involved in regulating calcium metabolism. We are not going to explore this in this presentation as much. We're going to explore the thyroid hormone in more detail. So this is a good diagram. It shows you here. This is your trachea. This part, the trachea, the grey part, is part of your respiratory system. So you've got the trachea here, the larynx is your voice box, and the thyroid gland is located around the trachea. And you can see the thyroid here, and then you also have the parathyroid gland kind of attached into it as well. So how is T4 and T3 produced? So T4 and T3 are a combination of the amino acid tyrosine and iodine. So we looked at this a little bit in part 2A. So T4 and T3, they are stored so they're produced from tyrosine and iodine, and then they're stored as something called thyroglobulin, and which is then released. They're then released into the blood as a result of TSH being released from the pituitary. But the key thing is that you have a store of T4 and T3 in your thyroid gland. They're stored as thyroglobulin, and then they're released into the blood when they're needed. And so the other key thing is that T4 and T3 are not water soluble. They are, even though they're amino acids and you'd think they'd be water soluble, they're not. So they need to basically have to be attached to a carrier protein like the sex hormones. So thyroxine binding globulin is a protein that transports T4 and T3 around the body. So what's the relationship between T4 and T3? So T4 is a pro-hormone. It's actually not the active hormone. It's kind of the precursor to the active hormone, which is T3. So T3 is the actual hormone that acts on the target tissue. So T3 is the hormone that binds to the tissue, triggers a response within the tissues. So you need to convert T4 into T3 in order to have a response. So this is T4 and T3 here. You can see T4 has 4 iodine molecules. T3 has 3. This part here is tyrosine. And then you have this part added on. So T3 is 3 iodines, T4 has 4. So this is another important diagram in a sense. So it shows you, it kind of summarizes what I've just said there. But so basically, you make a little bit of T3, but you make the majority of thyroid hormone that you make in the thyroid gland is T4. So they're produced in the thyroid gland, they're stored as thyroglobulin, and then when you need thyroid hormone, they are released. But most of the T4 is released, most of the thyroid hormone is in the form of T4. It's the pro hormone. So it's released and it attaches to a binding globulin here. And then T4 and the binding globulin, they travel through the blood to the target tissue. And so what happens is T4 is released from the binding globulin. It is transported across the membrane or through the membrane, and it's converted into T3 in the tissue or in the target cell. It can also be converted in the liver as well. So this conversion of T4 to T3 is really important because T3 is 5 to 10 times more active than T4. It's definitely the active hormone, and it requires selenium. So it's a nutrient dependent process. And what you will see in when you go to units 9 is you will see that the different nutrients. Selenium isn't the only nutrient that's required, but it's one of the key nutrients that's required to produce or to enable the conversion of T4 to T3. So how is the regulation of T3 and T4? What's the secretion regulation? So TSH is the key hormone that stimulates the production of thyroid hormone within the thyroid gland, and it also stimulates the growth of T4 or the thyroid gland. It's regulated by negative feedback, and this slide demonstrates to you the process. So we've got the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the thyroid gland. And so TRH is stimulated in release to, let's say, temperature changes or other brain centers or other activity from other brain centers. TRH is released. It binds to receptors in the anterior pituitary. This then triggers a production of TSH. TSH travels to the blood to the thyroid gland. It stimulates the production of T3 and T4 in the thyroid gland. They're stored as thyroglobulin, and then they're released when necessary. T4 and T3 are released. The majority is T4, and then it travels through the blood, and then it is converted into T3. It acts on cells and tissues, and it has a number of different roles. One of them is to increase metabolism, so the breakdown of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And this will, for example, lead to heat production. So heat is increased, and this then switches off centers in the brain that are telling you that you're cold, and that tells the hypothalamus to stop producing T or H. When you have a certain amount of T4 and T3 in the blood as well, it can also inhibit or act and have a negative feedback on the release of TRH and TSH. So thyroid hormones have a number of different activities, and they act on most tissues. And one of the key things that thyroid hormone does is it helps to regulate overall body metabolism. So it increases metabolic rate, basal metabolic rate. It increases oxygen consumption by most peripheral tissues, which will increase their ability to make energy. It increases body heat production, and it also stimulates protein synthesis and increased use of glucose and fatty acid for AT production. So it has this overall effect on regulating metabolism, and that's specifically T3 because, of course, T3 is the active hormone. Thyroid hormone, it's also involved in growth and development, so it initiates or sustains differentiation and growth. It's essential for childhood growth. It's also essential for neural development and maturation and function of the central nervous system. And it's also important for reproductive function because it affects the tissue of the reproductive system.